I'm back with a set of stories about a dark entity haunting a small farm home and the surrounding area of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Whether these are allegedly true or not, I cannot say. It comes to us anonymously from 4chan. Sorry for the nasally sound in my voice today. I just got back from my Texas visit and I'm sick with some sniffles. Speaking of which, what was your all-time favorite place you vacationed to? Remember to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org so I can narrate them. I'm looking for stories about hunting, hospitals, and Denmark. Check out eeriecast.com to enjoy our family of horror-themed shows. And today's thumbnail background illustration was created by Louceph. Check out the links in the description to see more from this talented artist. Now, let's begin. The White Man, by an anonymous poster on 4chan. Sunday, my father passed away. He'd be 55 come April. He and I were never close, although we had no bad blood between us either. We just had nothing in common, and I never cared, perhaps assuming we'd always have time to form a relationship later on. He wasn't unhealthy, so I never put much effort into going out and visiting him, and in fact I hadn't seen him in 3 years. Possibly I'm feeling guilty for never showing interest in my father. Perhaps I'm just missing him and want to talk about him. But tonight I want to tell you a story about my father, and maybe get some information on a thing he called the White Man. My father was a very typical suburban dad, and frankly very boring. He had typical dad interests, like fishing and hunting and bowling. He would wear Crocs and turtlenecks and drove a hatchback with a custom license plate. Despite his very upper-middle-class white dad exterior, he was a hick. A major hick. You see, my dad grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the 60s in a family that was dirt poor and very religious. I never met most of my extended family on his side, aside from his brother Philly, but from what I heard about them, I gather they were deliverance on ice. They lived in what had once been a cabin in the woods. They raised pigs and chickens and sold lumber for most of their income. His father beat my father and his siblings during drunken bouts, which left my father with some major scars, most physical, but a few pretty obvious mental ones too. What's important to note is that my father wasn't bright. He wasn't creative, he wasn't a storyteller, he could remember things and repeat them, and he could focus his energy into things, but he wasn't bright. Brains were not how he got where he was. So it's with this in mind that I ask you to handle his stories. My father used to talk freely of the White Man to my sister and I. More her than myself, as they were much closer. But was always careful to not mention him in front of my mother and Philly. Philly would make fun of him relentlessly for his boogeyman, and my mother never knew any of it. I suppose he was afraid of her thinking he was crazy. I grew up hearing about the White Man, who seemed to be a combination of all your typical boogeymen. He was capable of changing shape, but not color. In his regular form, he was vaguely humanoid but featureless. However, he could change into actual people or animals. He was old and not stupid, but still more animal than man. He chose people, followed them, and brought bad luck to them. And most importantly, he liked to make deals. The White Man wasn't a grim reaper of sorts, but he was a predator who showed up when a person was about to die or was hurt, and it was such that my father first saw him. Pardon if this isn't told that well, I admit I have little flair for stories and I've not heard any of these old tales in a long time, so a few details might be missing. One year about January, my father and Philly went out into the woods to go hunting. The two were about 10 and 9 years old, respectively, although Philly was apparently the leader. They wandered further from their home than usual, and it quickly got dark, which led to them getting disorientated and lost. What had initially begun as a simple afternoon hunt was now potentially life-threatening, for they didn't have the gear to easily survive the night. Things got worse, though, when the ground beneath my uncle gave away, revealing that in the dark they had wandered onto a pond which had frozen over and been covered by snow. It couldn't handle the weight of the two boys. My father, being, as I said, a bit stupid, took a moment to react to the situation before he began to try to help his brother out. After a short struggle, during which time my father got soaked as well, they managed to get Philly out of the water, although they were both now exhausted and wet and truly had no idea where they were, for there wasn't a pond anywhere near their house. The two eventually managed to get off the pond and into the woods in an effort to find shelter or their home. Eventually, they found a crevice beneath a tree and ducked into it for shelter, although it wasn't big enough for them to both fit at once. Being the drier of my two, my father volunteered to take the first shift out in the cold, while his brother tried to dry off in the crevice. Now here the story splits. The more reasonable one is Philly's version. He dozed off. My father woke him up a while later, told him they should keep moving. They did and kept wandering until they saw lights. Those lights were flashlights. The neighbors were out looking for them. They met up with the neighbors and went home. Their dad beat them. The hillbillies were all happy except my dad because he was crazy. And then there's my father's version. My father told me he sat out there, scanning the horizon and listening carefully for anything moving in the woods. Animals may mean better shelter or danger, and a person or some sort of vehicle meant rescue. After about 20 minutes, he begins to hear something. Footsteps. According to him, it sounded like a large man, and not all that far away, although he couldn't see anything, which surprised him a bit, as it wasn't all that dark, and even back then most people wandering in the woods tried to wear at least one bright item on them to avoid getting shot. But despite that, the noise got louder, until he finally saw it. A figure as white as snow, walking through the trees towards him. It was clear to him that it wasn't human, and he described it as being about 9 feet tall and shaped like Gumby. It had 2 arms, 2 legs, and 2 eyes, but no features. Everything was rounded. Scared to move, my father sat as still as he could, although it was clear the thing had already seen him. Slowly it moved towards him and began to speak. When it spoke, it didn't speak with a mouth. Instead, it was just 2 words. One heard and one responded the same. What that means is up to you to decide. The order of the conversation and the length I'm not sure of, but it told him that it was an old thing that lived in the cold and that it needed them. It came whenever people got too cold or too lost or hurt from animals or accidents, and it took them away if something else hadn't already. It had no interest in the dead, just the dying. Conversing with it was unsettling, but not unpleasant, according to my father. With that, it told him to get up so he could get his brother. Then they were to follow him away. My father, of course, refused and demanded they be left alone. Why, though? The thing had asked. You'll just freeze anyway, so it doesn't matter. Still, though, my dad refused to move, and eventually the thing asked him why he was so stubborn. It sounded a bit surprised, as if most people didn't argue much. I just don't want to die, or have him die, was the best my father could come up with.
Then we'll need to make a deal.
My father told me the thing which never, not over any of their visits, told him its name, if it had one. It talked like a car dealer or game show host. It tried to convince him what he really wanted, what he really needed. Wouldn't it be easier to go with him? Wouldn't that be simpler? But still, my father refused. Eventually, they settled. They would get out, but their lives would be on loan. It would be owed interest, and one day it would still come for them. The thing, which he eventually began calling the White Man, then began to walk off. Although it didn't say anything to him, my father said he understood that he was being let out now and that he should follow it. He woke up Philly, and the two headed off. Of course, you'd think he'd have been more suspicious of following a giant snow monster that had already tried to kidnap him, but my father wasn't bright or likely a great storyteller either. Before Philly was even awake, though, the monster had disappeared, the giant footsteps vanishing in the snow. At first, my father thought for sure he'd been cheated or simply abandoned, before realizing there was a trail of rabbit prints, which he began to follow instead, somehow understanding that those belonged to the monster. Occasionally, he'd catch a glimpse of an all-white rabbit, and it was then he understood the thing could change shape. After a while, they saw the lights of their neighbors in the distance headed towards them. As a kid, the story was a lot scarier, and I'm sure I'm missing a few details. Even then, though, I understood the plot holes and how far-fetched it was. My mother used to tell stories of how her childhood home had been haunted, all while telling us ghosts didn't exist, so I assumed this was something similar. A tall tale. Now, I don't really believe my father's stories, although I think he believed them for some reason or another. I just thought that maybe there's some Upper legend Google didn't pull up that he adapted this from. I want to say that my uncle again thought this was all a load of crap. When he would tell the story, it was just a story of how they got lost, almost died, and eventually got home to a butt-whooping. A few things my father added in he did agree on, though. There had been rabbit footprints, and possibly some bigger ones, although these looked like indents in the snow to him rather than actual prints, and my father did end up following a rabbit, which could have been white or blue for all he remembers, which he thought was a stupid idea even then. My uncle also didn't hear anything of the White Man, not until my father saw him again a year after they got lost. My father's excuse for not sharing this story with him was either he'd think he was crazy or think he was going to die, and only the shock of the next incident scared the story out of him. A year passed, and my father began to think he had maybe gone crazy that night, or that he had fallen asleep and dreamt it, and just woke up without realizing it. That is, until one night. Again, it was winter, with snow on the ground. He was out tending to the hogs alone with his dog. As a boy, my father had only two close friends, Philly and this dog, a Basset Beagle mix named Shorty. This was a fact he repeated time and time again during many stories of his childhood, which always made me wonder how his sisters felt. Were they not close? Guess not, since I never met them. Anyway, they're in the pig barn, which was far enough away from their house that in the summer, implying there is one, the smell of crap and pigs didn't waft indoors. The barn was capable of being opened on both sides, and in the warmer months, the back would be left open so that the hogs could enjoy the outdoors, while in the colder months, it'd be closed up tight. So, of course, my father was a little surprised to find the back of the barn open wide. This had happened once or twice before over the years, and usually meant he had to run back home and get his father and Philly, so they could hunt down all the pigs, who, even in cold weather, would head out in an effort to find food or get into something. But tonight, that wasn't an issue, because all the hogs were huddled as far from the door as possible and very reluctant to go out, even on a clear night. Assuming the pigs had gotten a bit of sense and didn't want to deal with the weather, he headed through the pen to close up the door, with Shorty following him the whole way. He gets there and Shorty takes one sniff before darting out the door howling and barking the whole way, obviously chasing after something. Shorty, my father would say, was a bit of a tattletale. If something was misbehaving, he'd try to stop it. When sneaking out or getting up past bedtime, you had to make sure the dog didn't see you. This applied to other animals too. If a pig or chicken didn't do what it was supposed to, the dog would get into it. So with that in mind, my father didn't think perhaps the dog was after something, but that it instead was scolding a hog that had wandered off alone. As quickly as possible. After all, pigs all look alike, move a good bit, and my father wasn't brilliant. My father counted up the pigs and noticed that one, in fact, an adult boar, was missing. So he headed out after Shorty to find the lost pig. In the still and the snow, it was easy to find Shorty. All he had to do was follow the dog's footprints, but that was when he realized something was wrong. Shorty's prints were in the snow, but they were not following the tracks of the hog. In fact, there were no prints from the hog, which there should have been. No new snow had fallen, and there wasn't enough wind to easily cover them. Furthermore, there were tracks. They just weren't from a pig. Instead, they were large, vague dints in the snow. These my father recognized. He had seen them before in the woods the year before, if only briefly. And there they were again, with Shorty on hot pursuit of the creature. Mustering up his courage, my father followed them as well. After all, he wanted to get his dog back, and, scared or not, he needed to at least look for him and the hog, or his father would kill him. The pen was decent-sized for a hog pen, but soon he hit the fence, which was made up of 5-foot-tall hog panels. Shorty was capable of climbing these. I'm assuming his build was more beagle than basset, because the image of a basset hound climbing a fence is hilarious to me. And he could see that the dog had already gone over the fence and into the woods. Of course, the fence had not stopped the white man either. His tracks simply went right over the fence, as if he hadn't even had to break stride to get over it. So my father climbed the fence, and soon he was in the woods too. The Upper Peninsula is really just woods and cleared woods for pins and buildings, and it wasn't long before he heard the barks of Shorty and the squeals of a frightened pig. Running now, he came to the scene quickly. Standing among the trees was the white man, who had seemingly grown bigger over the last year. In one arm, he held the struggling and screaming hog, which had to have weighed at least 400 pounds. A few feet away from him, carrying on, was Shorty, his hair on end and teeth bared, acting as if he had cornered the beast. There was no communication or confrontation between them, just an impression that the white man had waited for him, that he had stood there ignoring the dog just so he could get a glimpse of him. There was a brief pause, then my father realized something terrible. The white man did, in fact, have a mouth. Below the beady black eyes was a slit, a long line, and it opened just a bit to reveal teeth as white as the rest of him that shined in the moonlight. As quickly as he flashed the grin, he was gone. The white man silently took off, running into the woods, gracefully dodging between trees, with just the soft crunch of snow following him. Shorty took a few steps after him before my father had the mind to call him back, and the two headed home with my father sobbing the whole way. He got into trouble. He had the sense to not tell his parents what he saw, but he still got in trouble for losing a hog. He only ended up telling Philly because he couldn't stop crying, and even then he couldn't stop. Philly apparently didn't believe him much, but he didn't say anything to argue against it. Philly eventually began to write off everything as my father being schizophrenic, and the white man being the manifestation of it. I know nothing of mental disease, so I don't know if that diagnosis would ever hold up. Years went by before my father saw the white man again, although he claims to have known he was there during that time. Every winter, without fail, one hog or a group of chickens in a single night would go missing. Only once was there an exception. One year, a local boy went missing in the woods and never turned up. That year, no hog went missing from the farm. It was the livestock, as well as the sharp teeth, that led my father to the conclusion that the white man had to eat, and that he wasn't a vegetarian. The white man, though, never once told him he killed his victims, nor that he ate them. Considering what he took, though, my father thought it was easy enough to figure out. When he was 16, he saw the white man again. The exact age I remember, for it was when my father began to drive. It was late at night, and my father was driving home. He had begun to work at the nearest gas station, sometimes not coming home until late. It's worth noting that my father had his own set of skills and talents, such as being a hard worker or an excellent cook. But driving, especially in the winter, was not on that list. Driving scared my father. He was terrified of slipping or crashing, and drove very slowly and very cautiously. Never one to yell at us. He would snap if we talked too loudly in the car, or turned the radio up too high, because it began to make him nervous. With that in mind, what I'm about to tell you shouldn't surprise you. One day he crashed. Granted, he crashed trying to stop and help someone else who had crashed, but he still crashed. Another car had slid into the ditch along the rarely traveled road towards his house, and in the process of trying to stop and help, he too had an accident, one that was much more violent than the one he was trying to help. Somehow or another, he ended up hitting a tree hard enough to seriously damage his car and injure his leg. The driver of the other car came out to help him, and after realizing he couldn't walk back to town, decided to walk back on his own and get help for the both of them. My father thanked him, then the man went on his way. Now, granted, it was hillbilly heck out there, with it being winter and in the middle of nowhere, but it would, by my father's calculations, take less than an hour for the man to get back to the gas station and find help, and less than an hour for them to get back to him, because then they'd be driving, right? So in 2 hours, he'd be in the heated cab of a tow truck, either on the way to his house or a doctor's office. It was about midnight at that point, and my father had a wristwatch on which he'd check occasionally as he shivered in the dark. 1 a.m. comes around and 2 a.m. comes around. 3, 4. He eventually dozes off and wakes up shivering to the sound of footsteps, big and heavy like a man's. For whatever reason, he assumes that the guy couldn't find help, or that help couldn't get down the road, and he's come back to help him. Or maybe the guy just up and left and some other traveler has come to see if he's alive. He pulls himself up enough to look out the rearview mirror. That's when the pit dropped out of the bottom of his stomach. For you see, there wasn't a man in the snow. Even though he should have been able to see someone if he could hear them, there wasn't anyone there. The footsteps are, but there isn't a person. According to him, he felt as if he was in a nightmare and began looking frantically behind him, trying to see someone, hoping he was just overreacting. But then, he saw a long white form step in front of the brown and black of the trees. He realized it was the white man again, slowly stepping towards the car. His movements were slow and graceful, but he seemed a little worried. My father's never seen him in the open before, but there he was, moving cautiously, like a cat when it's worried about being seen at night. Eventually, the thing gets to the car and stops. Again, there are no angry words, no begging. In fact, although my father was scared crapless, he just clammed up and held still as they began to talk. This time, the conversation was short. One sentence, this time not said inside my father's mind.
"Don't worry, already paid."
With that, the giant keeps on moving, making a point of going across the road and into the woods on the other side as my father watched. Comedically, he always made a point to tell us that the white man stopped before crossing, making a point of checking for traffic before heading across. Once the beast was out of sight, my father began sobbing and kept sobbing until the mailman found him 4 hours later. Even in the Upper Peninsula, you gotta get mail. My father recovered, although he ended up having to spend a small fortune getting the car repaired. The other driver, a bit less lucky. He simply never showed up again. The man had left to find help, but never made it back into town. An investigation was opened, but leads all sputtered out. This last story is probably the last one for a bit that I remember clearly. Some of the others may be a bit fuzzy, because it's been about 10 years since I really heard any of them. Somehow my father knew that the white man was attached to the winter. This surely wasn't a surprise to anyone at all, seeing as he was a white monster in the Upper Peninsula that only showed up when snow fell. The issue, of course, was that it was often winter in the Upper Peninsula. A few more years went by with no really noteworthy incidents. The white man would take something every winter, but it didn't get Shorty or my grandmother or anything. By then, my father was 18 to 19 years old, getting ready to leave. His family was poor, and even if they hadn't been, my grandfather did not believe in college. With his sons now men, he gave them an option: become farmers, clergymen, lumberjacks, laborers, or get out and don't come back. It was because of Philly that they didn't do that, although I'm sure my father wanted to get away from the winter. Philly decided they'd both join the military and get out of there. Vietnam had recently ended, and he would joke that he thought he'd get sent somewhere warm, that had never seen snow. I guess I could lie and for comedy's effect say they both were sent to Alaska or Russia, but the truth is a bit more boring. They were accepted and went through basic training, but neither ever saw combat. Philly was removed from service for a birth defect eventually, and my father stayed in, but never did anything until his contract ran up, merely working on bases those few years. He asked to be transferred somewhere warm, and being liked by his higher-ups, he found himself in Texas. My father had tons of stories about weird things they'd find in the woods before he left the Upper Peninsula, and other odd incidents he tied vaguely to the white man, but it was some time before he saw him again. After all, he was tied to winter. It'd be a while before there'd be a reunion in Texas. But towards the end of my father's military contract, a storm hit the area he was stationed in, and brought with it snow. Being one of the few on the base who had any knowledge of how to handle the mess, he saw himself outside a lot during the storm. And it didn't take long before he realized the white man could travel. This storm lasted 2 days. On the second day, he woke up early to de-ice paths and roads. In a desolate part of the base, he was surprised to see another soldier in the distance, and grew a bit concerned when he realized the man wasn't moving. Quickly, he approached him, only to realize something. Again, there were no footprints leading out to this man, who he now realized was devoid of color, a detailed white shape with 2 dark eyes. If he hadn't been so surprised, he would have screamed. Instead, he claimed he probably looked as white as the white man himself, as the color left him.
No interest.
With that, the figure vanished. My father was found sometime later by a fellow soldier, staring into the distance across an open field. Exhaustion was his supposed excuse. 2 days later, he received a call from his older sister, informing him that his father had died. There wasn't much detail to go into. His father had simply fallen over in the field and died while feeding hogs, and that was that. No mess, no fuss. My father, understandably, didn't care much. If the white man did it, it wasn't much of a punishment. But he eventually came to decide the white man was, if nothing else, a bad omen. If anyone has any idea what this thing was, if my father wasn't just blowing smoke or is crazy, or if there's any legends like this one, let me know.